Welcome to the Urban Hope Podcast. I'm Katie Dudgeon, and this is your place for encouragement and conversation about the unique ways God is at work in the cities of Europe. We're so excited that you're joining us today.
Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about church planting in European cities, and we want to take a look at the work of City to City Europe in particular, and also focus a little on individual cities as case studies. For example, Frankfurt. Our guest today is Stephan Pues, European Director of City to City and a passionate church planter, pastor and networker in Frankfurt. Hello, Stephan.
Yep, thank you for having me here. Welcome.
Good to have you here, Stephan. I hope you're doing well. And tell us a little bit more about yourself and your life, please.
Yeah, I live in Frankfurt, not born here. I was born in Bonn, West Germany. I'm married for almost 25 years. We have 3 kids from 17 to 10. I'm a big soccer fan. I was just in the stadium yesterday of the greatest soccer club in the world.
Come on.
Borussia Dortmund.
And yes, you're right.
I do live in Frankfurt. I love urban living, actually. We live really in the center of the city, and we are a urban family, I would say. I'm 46, and I was part of 2 church plants here in Frankfurt, and we are very involved here, even as a family, with a whole network of church plants here in Frankfurt.
So how did you come to this topic of church planting yourself? What was it that grabbed you?
Yeah, I grew up in a variety of churches. So my personal family background is quite diverse when it comes to Christian traditions. I grew up being a believer, but with very different backgrounds in my whole family. From very Catholic to Brethren to Baptistic to Charismatic. It was all part of my parents' and grandparents' family setting. And through that, I was very, in some sense, inspired to work in church, even as a young student, and then went to study theology. During that time, I read a few books about church planting. Church planting was really not much around in the late 90s and early 2000s, so there was not a lot actually happening, and there was not a lot of people you could learn from or relate to. But my wife and I kind of read 1 or 2 books during my studies of theology, and we were like, man, this is something, one day when we die, it feels like this is something I want to look back at, and it's one thing I want to see as part of my life. And then through some connections of some colleagues of mine and friends, we got somehow connected to some people in New York and other places to help us to understand how churchment could happen. And then the vision was born to move to Frankfurt and to plant churches.
Super. Katie.
Wow. Can you tell us a little bit more about why Frankfurt? How did you end up there? And also, what do you like about it? You said earlier that you were an urban family. Tell us a little bit more about how you got there and what that's been like.
Well, Frankfurt is probably one of those cities, urban places in Europe that are very multicultural, very globally connected. Frankfurt is an Alpha Plus city on the Global Urban Index. So it's a place where a lot of people from global cities come to or move to work, or it has a lot of impact globally. Still, it's not a very large city, actually, but it has a lot of connections. It's the biggest airport. It's the financial center of Europe. The European Central Bank is here. So, and the culture of the city is one that I really like. I mean, every city has its different culture. Berlin is different than Munich, than Frankfurt. I think I fit Frankfurt pretty well. And I think I'm quite a prototype of my generation. I mean, in the time of my life, there was the shift from the majority of the people globally living in urban places now. So 2012, I think, is the tipping point. Now the majority of people on the planet live in cities.
Mm-hmm.
So born in the 70s and living today, a lot of people move, or humanity, you could argue, is basically moving to the urban place. And that's me. And I remember being born and raised not own. So I was born in a smaller city in Germany, but my dream was always to travel the big cities in the world, to live in New York, or to go study in overbroad in a city and live in a city. And we really are. I mean, we're an urban family, which means we don't have a car. We take public transportation everywhere. We live in a small apartment that's overpriced. We meet our friends not in our home, but in restaurants and third places. We probably have more direct connections, even friendship wise, to people in other cities than to the countryside in Germany. You know, these kind of things. And we're not stressed by urban life. So my wife and I, we love to travel to New York every year, and that gives us energy. I know there's other people who are totally exhausted when they go there, but things like that is, I think, something of a generational change, or you could even argue it's a historic moment in world history that God has now the majority of people living in cities, and that probably is pretty much my personal story as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Stefan, hearing you, uh, here comes the question: is there a certain type of person who is particular suitable as a church planter? A certain personality you need to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to plant a church in a city, you need a person that likes the urban or enjoys the urban living, loves cities. And it's actually an interesting question. Who is that? A certain person of like type of personality? I'm a trained personality tenor, and I have not yet seen how certain aspects of your personality actually make you more suitable for urban living. I don't think so. I think it's more a question of mindset and what you just enjoy. But the other aspect of that is, yes, there are people who are, I think, more gifted or wired to be able to be a church planter. So there is a certain type of personality or character or mindset or skill set if you want to lead or be part of a leadership of a church plant. Uh, we can talk a long time about what that means. So I'm recruiting and assessing church planters all the time, but it can be described a little bit like if you compare it to the business world, somebody who starts a company. It's a different kind of person who takes the company and grows it. So you need the church planter as kind of the innovative young start. No, it doesn't have to be young, but the innovative starter, loves creativity, likes to make failures, is good with people, communicates well. It's not very great at details. That kind of person is normally the more typical type that would work in a church plant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the person that uh, makes a good church planter, but what other factors go into helping a church plant succeed? What, from your experience, how many succeed, how many fail, so to speak? I don't know if we
Yeah.
can really say it's a failure. I'd also like to hear later on maybe what you think really is what is failure, because sometimes trying, God does things in our failure as well. But tell us a little bit more about your thoughts on what it takes to help church plants get off the ground.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Globally, I think there's a statistic that every second church plant is not going to survive long term as a church. So that gives a little bit of balance idea about how much what actually success looks like. I think in Europe we're seeing, at least in the network that I know, the rate is better than that. So more churches than that live long term and multiply. Um, well, what are the factors? I mean, yes, you do need a person or a little team that is the leadership. So leadership is there's a different kind of leadership needed in the planting process than maybe later in, once the church is established and needs to be led. It's a different kind of leadership that you need at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you definitely need a team. So I think you need a decent kind of, you can talk about critical mass or something like that. So you need a group that does that, and it depends a little bit on the model of church planting. So we're not restricted to one model. So we want to see multiple models. I do believe that actually to reach a whole city with the gospel, you need all kinds of different models of churches. So from the, you know, multiplying small group home church kind of church, all the way to the cathedral type of big church with a very prominent leader in the in the pulpit, all everything in between is needed to reach a whole city with the gospel. But I think there are principles, or there comparable things that make it work. I think the few I would say, one, I think you need to be very clear on the gospel. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that I would say. Uh, you need to know passionately and love it deep-heartedly, the great and good old, message from the cross. If that is not what you're all about, and you're not deep into that, and you don't dig out of that every day, or it comes out of every little hole in your church, then I think you're lost. I think it's the most crucial thing. I think it's often assumed that it's there and not talked about, but I think
Right.
it's the most important thing.
Mm.
So you need that. You need the gospel. You need the Spirit of God in there. You need the connection to Jesus and all that. And beside that, I think you need, I need to contextualize. I think we have too many um, examples in Europe where people from just other areas in the world had successful models, and they just tried to copy paste them to places in Europe, and it doesn't work, or it gives them a hard time. I think we have a little bit an overemphasis on big program attractional church planting models that I don't think work in the reality of Europe, at least right now, especially in the urban place. And I want to see contextualized, so fresh expressions. So not just a copy paste, something that worked in China or in Africa or in America, probably won't work in Europe. So we should do that more European style. And then I think the probably in the mentoring of church planter, from my experience, the most crucial factor is I think you need a truly missional life of the church planter and the whole group. So if you're not able to spend a majority of your time connecting with people who are not yet part of a church, who are probably even not yet part of faith, um, you will basically just gather other Christians around a cool hip new event in the city and call it church planting, which I would not call church planting. And that's what nobody else. I don't think anybody needs that anymore. I think it does more harm to the kingdom than it actually helps. So I think we really need, I would call them missional, or you could intentionally evangelistic, um, yeah, church planting projects who really reach out to people who nobody reaches in the city. And they're the big majority of the people in the urban places in Europe are not connected to any church or believer, and those people are the ones we need to focus, and not the group of Christians in the city who are looking for the hip, cool new worship event. We should stop doing that and not call it church planting anymore.
So, but generally speaking, what makes the church planting situation in the big cities so special?
Well, it is special in a way that it's kind of a little bit neglected, I would say. So I think the urban place for a long time, even theologically, was not a very um, it was not the place that where like ministers or Christians were encouraged to go. Um, and I think we need to change that somehow around. I mean, in the theological tradition that I'm part of, there's even something that we call urban theology. So I do think you can argue with the Bible that God loves cities because there's so many people in cities. I mean, if you read the book of Jeremiah or Jonah or even Book of Acts, is an urban story. I mean, Paul went to all the big cities in the Roman Empire and started gospel movements there. So if we today talk about church planting or gospel movements in the cities of Europe, that's what Paul did. It's exactly the book of Acts. And I think that's what we need to rethink, especially in a generation that is now majority urban. I think church should be intentionally and strategically going to the urban places. And that is somehow lost. I haven't figured out when and why, but it's somehow lost. And I think there are some specialties or some things that you only find in the urban place. I mean, a quick summary is I think the urban place is more innovative, it's more expensive, it's more multicultural, it is more these kind of factors. There are several things that each one of those words is worth a whole podcast probably, but there are some things in the urban place that are different to the not urban place or mid-sized town or a small town reality, and that is something that you need to take in account when you contextualize and just do it differently. Yeah.
So how do the other churches deal with your vision when you come to a place or somebody wants to start a church? Maybe there's a team. How do you get into contact with the other actors in that place?
Yeah, I think it's very intentional to have a kingdom mindset. So not to have this mindset, with me, Jesus and his church comes for the first time to the city, or everybody else is doing it wrong, I'm doing it right. I think you have to have a kingdom mindset, which means I'm part of a bigger kingdom, and I have to be intentional about this. Everybody else is already there, and I should learn. I should come first with a humble approach and learn from the others who have already been serving for decades in the city and connect with them. So I think you need to somehow intentionally connect with either networks or individuals that are there. I would always encourage, be part of something like the Alliance or whatever it's called, but there are networks normally. And I think it's very important to do that. I think for too long, probably several decades, church planting normally meant competition to the rest of the church. And that doesn't help. It doesn't help both ways. And it created in many cities of Europe almost like an allergic reaction to everybody else in the city when you come and say, I'm planting a new church in this city. And that has a history to it, a totally understandable history, because sometimes church planting, or oftentimes, it meant, I'm coming with a lot of money and I'm coming with new people, and I want to take away your youth group, or at least a big part of it, and they're going to be part of my church now. So it's sheep stealing. And I don't think that Jesus called us to do that. So I think you have to somehow intentionally relate to the others, and you have to have a culture or a posture. What do you do when people from other churches show up at your door, and what do you do with them? And I think in general, you should say, well, thank you for your interest, but can I help you to be a blessing to the church you're already part of? And not, welcome. Now you finally have a great church. Come here. I think there should be the growth. So it's a question of theory of change. So the growth of the church plant should mainly come through new people that nobody has reached until now, and not through just taking people from other churches. I don't think that is efficient, and I would even say not a very gospel-minded approach.
So if I got you right, and the vision of city to city, it's always about a movement, a gospel movement, not just a church planting movement. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the question of the why. So why do we plant churches? So we don't plant churches because we want to plant churches. Church planting is a strategy or a process to see something happen that really is at our heart, and that is to reach the urban group with the gospel. I think church planting is, a very strategic way to address the problem that we're trying to face, and that is that the majority of the urban people in Europe are have nobody in their whole network of friends, colleagues, and neighbors that would share the gospel with them or invite them to a relevant church. Some cities in Europe are significantly below 1% of people who love the gospel and want to share it. There's basically just a few little exceptions, like a city like London has about 9 to 10%, but majority of the cities are, like Frankfurt or Vienna or these places. It's very, very low, which means that the big majority of the people in the cities have no one who would ever share the gospel or could even ever share the gospel with them that they know, neither at work, neither in their apartment where they live, or in their group of friends. And that moves us. So it doesn't move me that much that we need to plant more churches, to be honest. It moves me that there are millions and millions of people in the cities of Europe who I feel called to. And I do think that church planting is the most strategic, or one of the most strategic ways to address that. And that's why I think I'm totally passionate about church planting, because I think that's how we long-term change that. And I think we should do that. Yeah, that's why we call it. We want to see a movement of the gospel through church planting. There are probably other things that need to happen in the city to also contribute to a whole gospel movement, for sure. But we kind of feel called that our contribution is the church planting part, and that's why City and some other networks that we're connected with are all about, well, let's plant a significant number of churches in the cities of Europe that could change something.
So I have another question concerning the vision. When you speak about reaching people with the gospel, do you have a broader vision for the city? Do you envision something
Yes.
changed through God's justice, shalom, grace? Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that it's not just about saving individuals' life for heaven. Yeah. That's a very individualistic answer of the gospel. I think the gospel also has a communal aspect, and it should actually help into the development of the whole city. It's a little bit like what God told to Jeremiah, right? Pray for the well-being of the whole city that God has sent you to. So I think if we see that movement of the gospel through church planting and more things in the city, it will have an effect. And that's not a like an accidental side effect, but it's a very intentional part of the vision, that we do believe that through that, some of the culture of the city will change. I think the way we handle money, the way we handle relationships, the way we handle our environment, and all these things should be impacted by a growing number of people who believe and live out the gospel in those cities and are very intentional about it. And that's definitely something, we call that a gospel ecosystem. So that's when, out of churches that are there and those who are planted, when they join together in a collaborative way, also, some projects about faith and work, or faith in justice, faith in politics, faith in arts, faith in environment, faith in industries, all these kind of things will be formed. And that's something we want to be intentional about. And it's part of our vision and story that this is what we want to do. But again, I think the church planting and like dynamic in the city is kind of the one that should grow these other things. So, yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about how you're seeing people actually being reached with the gospel, people who, like you described earlier, kind of those they don't know a believer, they don't have a lot of experience with Christianity or the church, and maybe are even resistant to the church or apathetic toward the church. Many people would describe the spirituality of Europe as post-Christian. So how are you seeing the church actually be effective to reach people when they've said, "Hey, we're not interested in church"?
Yeah, that's true. We use three words to describe the culture of the urban crowd in Europe. It's post-Christian, postmodern, and post-secular.
Mm-hmm.
Post-Christian, the one you mentioned, means that the majority of people who live in the urban place in Europe don't think that Christendom or the church as an institution is of any relevance. It's almost, the narrative is almost like, well, somehow it's good that they're not that much there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because that we remember the time when they were big. It was when women couldn't vote, and when authority, the monarchs were big, and all these bad things happened in Europe. And in some sense, they're probably right. In some sense, there were some things that the church needs to be blamed for, and we need to adjust and change. But there is definitely almost like an allergic reaction to Christendom or uh, the institution of church as a dominating factor in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's even healthy to change that. Um, and I think that is not that easy to overcome. The second is postmodern. And that's a long, long conversation what that actually means. But there's an understanding of truth in it. There's an understanding of guilt in it. There's an understanding of society and all these kind of things in it that I think is changing with a one or two generation changes. And I don't think that the gospel is actually more modern or more postmodern. I think the gospel has made it through a lot of society changes and is not bound to one of those. So the modern age is somehow at an end. And sometimes it feels to me that especially the evangelical Christians are a little bit trying to hold on to a modern version of church or gospel. But the gospel can always adjust to a new generation. And I think there's huge opportunities for the gospel in the young generation or in the urban generation if you just let go of the modern concepts of these kind of things. And the third thing actually makes a lot of hope, I think. It's called post-secular, and it's the idea that, people are not believing in the normal narrative of the 20th century, which meant that in the future everything is going to be secular. That's basically over. Um, Nobody really thinks here in Europe, I think, probably there will be people, but there's a majority of people now that know that, everything is more and more coming back to an interest and a openness to spiritual things. Not in the way our great grandparents approached them. Yes, that's post Christian. But there's huge opportunities and openness if the church is again willing to adjust to a new generation, which they should from the gospel, which contextualizes. So I think there's huge opportunities in that. Yes, you do. And you asked the question more concrete. How do you do that? Or how do you reach those people? Or what are your experiences? So I do see churches that are in a very motivated, vision-driven, and on the other hand, humble way, taking a long breath, reaching the people that no church reaches in their city by being very intentional about those relationships and then learning from that. So I think we need to listen to the people and ask them, how should church be designed in a way that you would go to it? And I don't mean the core. So I don't think we should water down our gospel so that people like to hear it more. No. That was never helpful in church history. But the ways we design it, or the ways we build church, should be more listened to the people we actually meet in the European cities than any models in the history of the church or models in other parts of the world. I think if the place where people take that approach, I see very interesting results happening. And I could tell a lot of stories about examples now, but
Yeah,
places
please.
where that is happening. Yeah.
Please give us some examples, Stefan.
Well, in Europe, for example, my friends in Athens, they planted about a dozen churches in the last decade, and out of actually one denomination in a network, and they all look quite different. So one is in a very left-wing neighborhood called Exarchia. One is in a more educated, um, well-situated neighborhoods near the airport, and so they all have the same gospel, and they're very like straight and orthodox on that. But they look quite different in the way they reach out, the programs they run, the time of their service, the style of their worship, even the way they design small groups and all these things is quite different. Even the way they run leadership, and it looks different. They're all from the same family of churches, but they look quite different because they really intentionally took time to ask the people in the neighborhood how the church should look like. Or also here in Frankfurt, if you plant a church in Frankfurt and you start in Sachsenhausen, you will find another crowd of people than if you plant in the Nordweststadt or in Offenbach or in the center here. And I think that's the beauty of a approach that focuses contextualization, where you then ask those questions and change them. So my good friend Leone, who plants in Offenbach here next to Frankfurt or part of Frankfurt, he is a very gifted guy from Cameroon who came to Germany, learned perfect German, also speaks like 5 or 6 other languages, lives in a neighborhood where there's a very high concentration of international people, and the way he designed his church is very multicultural. So they speak different languages. They help people to integrate into the German culture. They run a kids program or a kindergarten, a community center. So it looks quite different than the church that I planted about at the same time. Not from the gospel, but definitely from the way things are designed. Yeah.
How did you start in Frankfurt, Stephan?
We moved to a neighborhood that's pretty much inner city. So if you know Frankfurt a little bit, there's the Zeil, the main shopping place. If you walk 10 minutes to the northeast, then you come to the Bergerstraße, which is the coolest hangout area in Frankfurt, I would say. So that's where people go after work to have a drink or a meal. That's my neighborhood. It's about 45, 50,000 people who are living there. And we went and we had about 12 people that were, through connections, prayer, and vision, basically committed to move to this neighborhood with us. Most of them not from Frankfurt. And then we took 2 years without starting any programs, services, or anything churchy in terms of events. We just connected with the neighborhood and tried to ask the people the question, how can we serve you? Or what is it that is needed here? And what would a church look like that, you would like to go to? Or at least figure out, even if you maybe never believe in that Jesus, but how should a church look like that you would at least take a look at? Yeah. And from that, we then kind of began to design the way we planted our church. And that's what we did.
Who was part of your team in that process? When you say we, who else was there beside your family or?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we had, so including my family or my wife and me, we had 12 people. And it was an interesting group of couples, some with kids, some not, some singles, some internationals. And then, they all had their jobs. They all found a apartment they could live in, which was quite a story of miracles to find something like that in one neighborhood. And then we just lived here. And it was very important for us that everybody was local. So I do really somehow believe in local church planting, to incarnate into a place or an area of the city and live there and get to know the people there. And they were all passionate about the gospel and Jesus. Mm-hmm. They also came a little bit from different traditions, but they were kind of committed to go to join that adventure. Yeah.
What surprised you, or what was unexpected in that process? Either your personal experience or what you saw God do, or?
Yeah. Probably everything. I mean, if you don't take a template, a copy paste approach, then you have to basically you almost come open handed, and you don't have a lot that you expect. I mean, what surprised me? One thing that I didn't really expect is that the result, for example, of the Sunday service that we did, asking probably hundreds of people in the neighborhood, it was quite a traditional liturgic Sunday service without a screen and any fog machines. It looked much more. The, the people said, "We want old Christian hymns. We want a creed. We want the Lord's Prayer. We want."
Mm.
We want you to do the cross sign and all this. That's what they said. That's what we expect. And this was not people from the church telling me to do that. They actually didn't like that a lot. But it was basically the people in the neighborhood who were far away from church who said, well, if I ever come to a church, that's what I want. And then that's basically how we designed it.
Why that? So there was some kind of cultural Christian heritage in their mind, or
Yeah, probably. I mean, people still have, even if they never. So we had all the time, regularly, we had people who came to some of our events or our Sunday service, and they afterwards talked to me and said, Stefan, do you actually know that was my first time today being in a church? So we had regular people like that. So these were not people who grew up in church, so what we call the de-churched people. These were really unchurched people. But they still have like some expectation, I don't know, from movies or from something where they like, well, they have some idea of how church could look like. And that's what I found very interesting. They have desires and dreams about how their personal spirituality should be unfold, or what you could do that would be beneficial for them in their spiritual journey. And in our case, because I mean, we live in one of those neighborhoods where most of the people work full jobs and are like like all the time working a lot in Frankfurt. Frankfurt is a very busy working city. It's a you know it's one of those places where we do have a skyline, but people work late and that kind of stuff. And they said, well, my experience with God or with spirituality should not be very hectic. It should not be very loud. I actually want silence. I want time to meditate. I don't want to be welcomed by a loud music, or I don't want to be bothered with a big screen in front. I have that every day. I want something where I can go on a spiritual journey that has more to do with silence or with meditation. And that was independent from any, they didn't even know about some church traditions that highlight that. It was just more out of their personal desire.
Mm-hmm. And when people like that would come and experience the church for the first time, or with that, those who haven't had a background, maybe unchurched, like you said, did that lead to more conversations about spiritual things in their lives, or what were their reasons for coming? Was it to have a meditative experience, or was it to be maybe explore being part of a community? Or was it, things happening in their own lives and they wanted to process them somewhere safe? What's been your experience with that, and why people have come, and what's happened after they've maybe shown up?
Well, I think one part of the question is, well, how did they make it to come, or why did they come? I think several reasons, probably a mix of what you mentioned, but it was always linked to a personal relationship. So I think that's very, very important today, that we don't think, I think the church for a too long time just put a sound out there and prepared a sermon and turned on the music and thought all the people will come. But I think what we saw is that the people who will come are the ones who have somehow a relationship to a neighbor, a colleague or someone who is part of a church. So it needs that missional, relational, organic approach. Without that, I don't think you will see a lot of really new people approaching a church. The cities of Europe are not waiting for more churches to be planted so that they can come to it. It needs the relational work. And then the second part of the question is, so how did these people respond? So I think many of them responded quite positively in terms of, this is something really interesting. And I had a posture that every time somebody comes to me and says that, I would beg them to allow me to buy them a coffee, a meal, or a beer in the coming week and just ask them about that experience. I was so curious always, just, and I met with them and I said, I'm not gonna try to tell you anything about my faith or my church. I only want to listen to you and hear from that experience because it's so valuable. If you're a person who is new to the church or new to the whole Christian idea, I just want to know how that whole thing, affected you, or what did you experience? Because I cannot see the church with your eyes, but I want to. I need to learn from you. And if something that I can share with you is beneficial for you, then great. But I think that kind of posture to see the people as, I'm born and raised in the church. I have no way to experience or even come close to what people hear and see and feel when they enter a church. But I need to know because I need to be aware of what they do. And I sometimes really made major changes from those conversations about the way we do things. Some of our Christian friends in the church really hated that stuff, but I was like, no, we need to focus on those people because they are the ones that Jesus called us to. The church is not there for the church for the sheep who are in the barn. It's there for the lost ones. Jesus was so clear about that. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer said. Church is only church if it's church for the others, and it's defining church. And we need to. That's how we. I often really made some major shifts in the way we did things from conversations with the people who are new, because they said, this doesn't make any sense to me. This is offensive to me. And then I said, okay, well then maybe we need to change it. Yeah.
Can you give us an example of something like that you changed? Because I know earlier you talked about keeping the gospel at the center of everything we do as well and not watering things down. And tell us a little bit more about what that looked like.
I love that question. I think the church, so in the way it contextualizes, needs to come with one open and one closed hand. So the closed hand is the one where we hold the things that should never be changed. So I do really remember there was always this one guy. He came to our church because I think he liked the community, and he came every once in a while, and he always did the same thing. So after the service, he came to me and he said, I like this. I feel part of this church. But Stephan, does it really always have to be about Jesus? Can we not talk about other stuff as well? And I was like, well, no. Sorry, no. That's not possible. This is church, and this is about the gospel. We will not talk about anything else. Sorry that you don't like that, but I hope you still inspires you in that. So that's closed-hand issues. And open-handed issues are the ones that we have to change in some sense. We have to adjust. That's what Paul said. I'm going to be a Jew to the Jews, a Greek to the Greek, and whatever, in order to reach people. I think that's the calling. That's what the gospel does with us, because the gospel is an incarnational idea. So it's what Jesus did when he came to the world. That's what we're celebrating right now on Christmas. Is the most radical contextualization that ever happened was that the Son of God became human. He didn't just show up on the sky and gave us his message. He became actually one of us and contextualized him so radical, even later on the cross, even more, he identified with our sin. And it's that kind of process that we need. But he didn't change being God. So he had closed-hand issues, right?
Yeah.
But he also was very, very innovative and very contextualized. And that's, I think, the power of the gospel, I think, results in that. Because the gospel is not religion or the gospel is not a worldview. The gospel is a power that, in some sense is how the Father sent me, I'm going to send you. So the gospel, the grace of the gospel, which is neither being, so the gospel is always the third way between legalism and liberalism. So between these two, and it actually causes us to not adopt fully or to withdraw fully. These are the two traps. The gospel causes us to incarnate and to redeem somehow the culture, and that's, I think, where that's why I think this is important. I think you really have to draw the powerful contextualization, and even for missional life and evangelistic motivation, you have to draw it from the gospel. You have to draw it from, well, there was somebody else who did that for me in a much more radical way than I am called to do it for the people in my neighborhood. And that needs to be the motivation and the principle for that. Yeah.
Can you briefly define what you mean with contextualization? Just a brief definition.
Oh, yeah. I cannot give you the academic correct one. There are good books written about that I don't have in my head. But I think the idea behind that is that from the gospel, there's this idea that you will neither dominate nor withdraw from the culture, but you will go and incarnate or kind of adjust to the culture in the areas that are flexible, not in the ones that are closed-handed. And you will, out of love and out of humbleness and out of calling to those people, become a Jew to the Jew and a Greek to the Greek and that kind of thing. There's a beauty in that. And I think it also relates to the urban reality a lot, because the urban places are the most innovative, the centers of innovation. And that's some people even say that creativity and innovation is one of the most important competencies of the next generation. And in some sense, there's nothing more powerful for innovation and creativity than grace, than gospel. So that is purely contextualization. So it's basically the ongoing process of the church to always adjust to a new generation, to a new culture, to a new reality. I think the church has done that sometimes well over the last 2,000 years. There's amazing stories in mission work that, can tell stories about that. But I think we need to, in general, do that more now with the urban place. Church has to understand and contextualize to the urban reality. This is why podcasts and initiatives like this are so valuable, because we somehow altogether need to learn how church would work in the urban place. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not giving an academic answer.
No, it was good. It was good. No. It's good. I just want to understand how you approach the topic. Can we look a little bit more at the wider picture? So you work for a network, for an organization called City to City. I'm sure a couple of urban engaged people, listeners, already know about it. But tell us more about this network. How do you work? How did it develop? And where are you active in Europe?
Yeah, so City City had its origin or its beginning in New York City. The name Tim Keller might be familiar with some people. He was a guy who went into Manhattan and planted a church in the 90s with those principles, gospel-centered, contextualized, missional, these kind of things. And he was actually quite successful at reaching people who are unreached. And in this way, actually, New York is a very interesting example to look at from the European perspective. Very different than many other American cities, because it feels very European or more European. And the percentage of people who were active believers or church members was very low in the 90s. And he didn't only plant one church, but he was actually trying to connect with other people in the city from different cultures, different denominations, different Christian backgrounds, to collaborate. So these are the two things that I think City City is trying to combine. So how can we plant more churches, but not on our own? But how can we come into, or how can we behave in a city in a way that we are a uniting factor, at least in the church? I mean, we will not collaborate with everybody in the city when it comes to church planting, because you need to have the clear core. So there are churches who are, I would say, too legalistic or too pragmatic or too maybe even questioning the gospel in some sense. That's where we would say then that's beyond the boundaries. But in general, there are people from other tribes, denominations, organizations, networks, and backgrounds in the city that could work together. And these two things are, that's what Tim did in New York, and that's what was quite successful actually there. And what we have been seeing is helpful in a whole group of cities in Europe. So City City Europe, or City City is globally, is a network of people who try to help people plant churches in cities in a collaborative way, with the gospel and with those principles we already talked about it. And so we come alongside people who want to plant a church in any urban place and then want to connect with others to multiply that. And we've seen quite some. So we were there for 15 years now, City City Europe. So I didn't start it. I'm in this role for 5 years now, and there's quite a very, I have to say, a very encouraging group of people and of cities who are beginning to. I would not call it a movement yet, but it's maybe a birth of a growing collaboration that could really result into a movement because it's multiplying and it's collaborative across different tribes. But the one thing that City City has been and always will be about is how do we plant more churches through that? So how do we not just collaborate? So collaboration can also be just for collaboration's sake. But I think we want to be a community with a cause, and the cause is to see a movement of the gospel through church planting. Yeah. And where people want to try that, that's where we are coming alongside and helping. Yeah.
What are the greatest or the biggest obstacles you see when it comes to church planting in Europe?
Wow. Probably the biggest need or the biggest lack is actually really lack of good leaders. I think the people who would be the ones who go on that journey and who have a strong character, who are straight on the gospel, and who are ready to invest. I think one other obstacle is that sometimes people think of church planting as a too quick and manageable process. I think it is something that will take a while. So if God calls you to plant a church in one of the cities of Europe, it will not be done in 3 years, and you will not see a quick success. The reality in Europe, and I begin to see it more as a beauty, to be honest, than as a problem. I think the reality in Europe is that the time between seeding and harvesting takes long. Fruit it takes a while. And I think one of the obstacles is that we're trying to bypass that. Or we're trying then again focus on like gathering Christians from other churches because it's quicker. But I think there's a beauty in that process. And I think somehow we need to just be patient about that. And I think another big obstacle in some sense is that I think we somehow need to, rediscover the gospel. I know that sounds like a cheesy answer, but I really mean it. I think that if we would get the gospel really straight and really clear and really passionate in our hearts, we would handle some of the challenges in church planting differently, and we would plant other churches. So in some sense, I hope that, it's not just a big movement of church plants, so the number of church plants that being planted. I think that's very crucial. But in some sense, I think we need to come back like Luther did, or Spener, or some others, actually come back to the gospel as the one thing. I think it's still true what Paul said. The gospel is the power of God saving people. It's not my perfect church planting concept, program, method, whatever. It's just the gospel. And so the one thing that I would like to write on every church's door is what Luther knocked on the door in Wittenberg. One of his theses, I think it's number 64, is that the gospel, no, he said, I think the true treasure of the church is the holy gospel of the grace of God. And I think that's the only treasure. I think we're tending in church planting, we're thinking, and also in church development, I think we're often thinking the one thing that you have to do right is that cell group concept, or that evangelistic program, or that style of leadership, or this version of worship, or whatever, and then it's going to work. Well, I would hardly argue that the one thing that you need, the only one thing that you need to make it work, is the simple and beautiful gospel of Jesus. And if you add anything to it, you're going to have a problem, even in church planting. So I think that's where I would say these are some obstacles. Yeah.
Good. Katie, we have a question. The question of hope.
Yes. What is giving you hope these days?
Oh, me personally?
What is bringing you hope? Yes. In your role, as you're going about your day, as you're walking the streets of Frankfurt or training leaders, what's bringing you hope?
I was at a gathering that I just attended. Somebody else organized it here in Frankfurt about 2 months ago, where we invited everybody who is somehow involved in church planting as a leader in Frankfurt. And this is where in 2023, in 2014, a group of leaders in Frankfurt, we sat together and we prayed a brave prayer, and we were like, maybe we can plant 10 churches in the next 10 years in the city of Frankfurt. And it sounded like rocket science. And here we are, 2023, and in the room were about 30 people gathered who are right now working on a church planting project. And I was like blown away. Wow. Because this feels like God is moving something. This is not something that I feel like somebody engineered. It's something that is happening. And we're not at all at a level of revival or anything like that. But I think we're beginning in some cities in Europe to see that through collaboration and gospel dynamics and intentional church planting, it's beginning to come to a point where it's multiplying, where it's really running. So it doesn't feel that hard and painful anymore to see more churches planted. And I think that gives me really hope to see that. Yeah.
Great. Well, encouraging closure. Katie.
Yeah. Thank you so much for what you shared today. And you've given us a lot to think about, and even just what you just shared that has that image is going to stick with me. And I hope it does in the ears of our listeners as well, that there are those moments where we pray, we plan and dream. And later on, we realize God is at work. God did some of those things. God is working in it. Maybe it looked different than we expected, but he can do that. And there is movement. So thank you so much. But that's it for today then on the Urban Hope podcast. We're so thankful that you were able to join us today, Stephan. And you will find this episode and future episodes on our website at urbanhope.eu. And every 2 months, we offer an online conversation with European urban leaders. And you can sign up for that and get the link on that website as well. So the Urban Hope podcast is a production of the European Evangelical Alliance, Cities Network, and the Berlin Institute for Urban Theology. We are partnering with other networks like City to City Europe, Kairos, and City Changers. So feel free to follow us on social media, and we look forward to the next edition of Urban Hope. In the meantime, stay hopeful and be encouraged.